I've always loved my farm. It's been in my family for generations, nestled at the edge of a dense forest, far enough from the city to enjoy peace, but close enough that I wasn't entirely isolated. I ran a modest homestead, growing vegetables, keeping chickens, and enjoying the serenity of nature. One of my favorite parts of living here was the wildlife, especially a young deer I had affectionately named Clover. She had been visiting my property for over a year, a beautiful doe with a distinctive white patch on her neck. Unlike most wild deer, Clover wasn't skittish around me. She had been part of a local wildlife research program, fitted with a small GPS collar to track migration patterns and ecological impact. The researchers had asked for my permission to track her on my land, and I had eagerly agreed, happy to help with conservation efforts. I had even come to look forward to her visits, leaving out small piles of apple slices as a treat. But my peaceful relationship with Clover had not gone unnoticed by the HOA, specifically by Linda, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. While my farm wasn't technically under the HOA's jurisdiction, Linda treated me like a personal thorn in her side. She hated that my property wasn't as pristine as the cookie-cutter houses she lorded over. I had refused to join the HOA, much to her dismay, and she made it her personal mission to harass me whenever possible. First, it was complaints about my chicken coop. Then she tried to enforce rules that didn't even apply to me, like limiting the number of lawn ornaments, after she saw my old tractor parked near my barn. But nothing infuriated her more than my connection to Clover. Linda despised wildlife. She called them pests and disease-ridden nuisances, frequently ranting about how deer were a menace to gardens and a danger to the roads. I had caught her shooing Clover away before, clapping loudly and chasing her toward the woods whenever she came too close to the HOA's property line. I had warned her Clover was part of a research project, and disturbing her could have consequences. Linda, of course, didn't care. If it's on my land, it's fair game. She had snapped at me one afternoon when I caught her throwing rocks in Clover's direction. I should have taken her hostility more seriously, but I never thought she would do something truly reckless. Then, one crisp autumn morning, Clover stopped visiting. At first, I wasn't alarmed. She was a wild animal, after all, and sometimes deer wandered off for a few days. But as a week passed with no sign of her, I began to worry. I contacted the wildlife researchers, asking if they had any updates on her GPS location. What they told me sent a chill down my spine. Clover's tracker had gone dead. The last recorded location was dangerously close to Linda's backyard. My stomach twisted with dread. Had something happened to Clover? Had she been injured or, God forbid, killed? I had to find out the truth. Determined to find out what had happened to Clover, I set out early the next morning, heading toward the last recorded GPS location. My farm bordered a stretch of wooded land behind the HOA development, and according to the wildlife researchers, Clover's tracker had last pinged near Linda's backyard before going silent. That alone was suspicious. GPS collars didn't just die overnight, these were designed to last for years. As I approached Linda's property, I noticed something disturbing, a pile of bones near her back fence. The sight of scattered deer remains, picked over by scavengers, made my stomach lurch. There was no mistaking it. This had once been a deer, and judging by the small size and familiar white markings, I had a sinking feeling that it was Clover. My hands clenched into fists as I scanned the area, noticing something half buried in the dirt. Digging through the damp soil, my fingers closed around a broken piece of plastic, a fragment of a GPS tracker. My heart pounded as realization set in. Someone had deliberately destroyed Clover's tracker. My mind raced with questions, but only one person came to mind, Linda. My pulse roared in my ears as I stormed toward her house, my boots crunching against the gravel. I didn't bother knocking. I found her in her backyard, lounging on a deck chair with a smug expression, sipping her morning coffee. The moment she saw me, her lips curled into a self-satisfied smile. "Well, well," she said, setting down her mug. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I could barely contain my anger. "Where is Clover?" I demanded, holding up the shattered piece of the tracker. "What did you do?" Linda shrugged, feigning innocence. "Oh, you mean that pest of a deer? You're making such a fuss over a dumb animal." I could feel my fist shaking. That dumb animal was part of a federally funded research project. That tracker you destroyed? It wasn't just some decoration. Linda's expression didn't falter, but I caught the slight twitch in her eye. Oh, please, she scoffed. It was just a deer. If it was stupid enough to wander into my yard, that's on it. And besides, she smirked, I thought you'd be happy for me. I finally put that thing out of its misery. My breath caught in my throat. The casual cruelty in her voice made my blood boil. You killed her. My voice was barely a whisper, shaking with fury. Oh, don't be so dramatic, Linda said, rolling her eyes. It's called hunting. Perfectly legal, by the way. I wanted to scream. Hunting. There were strict laws about hunting in residential areas, not to mention that killing a research-tracked animal came with serious consequences. I gritted my teeth, my mind racing. She had to be lying, right? Maybe Clover had been injured, and Linda was just taking credit for it to get under my skin. But the smug look on her face told me everything I needed to know. She was proud of what she had done. You're going to regret this, I said, my voice low with fury. We'll see about that, she shot back unfazed. Good luck proving anything. That was the moment I realized Linda wasn't just cruel. She was arrogant enough to think she could get away with it. But she had no idea who she was messing with. If she thought she could just kill Clover and walk away, she was dead wrong. I stormed back to my farm, my mind spinning with rage and determination. Linda thought she could get away with this. She thought she was untouchable, that killing Clover was just another one of her power plays. But she had no idea that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. I wasn't going to let Clover's death go unanswered. I needed proof, and I needed it fast. The first thing I did was contact the wildlife research team. I explained what had happened, the missing GPS signal, the broken tracker, and the suspicious remains I had found near Linda's property. They were immediately concerned. That's a federal offense, one of them said, his voice tense. Tampering with research equipment, let alone poaching a tagged animal, is serious. We need to investigate this. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. They assured me they would send a team to inspect the site and gather whatever evidence they could. But I knew I couldn't rely on them alone. Linda was crafty, and if she had really killed Clover, she might have covered her tracks well enough to cast doubt on any accusations. I needed something undeniable, something that would leave no room for her to weasel her way out. I started by checking my own property for any security footage. I didn't have cameras directly facing the wooded area where Clover roamed, but I did have a few that overlooked my barn and driveway. I spent hours combing through footage, hoping to catch any glimpse of Clover before she disappeared. Then, just past midnight, I found a grainy but clear enough video from a week ago showing Clover standing near my fence line, looking in the direction of Linda's property. Not long after, a movement in the distance caught my eye. Someone, dressed in dark clothing, was moving through the trees with a crossbow. My blood ran cold. I rewound the footage and watched it again. The figure was unmistakable. It was Linda. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, it was all her. She had been stalking Clover, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I clenched my fists as I kept watching. A few minutes later, Clover startled and darted out of frame. And then in the distance, I heard it, the distinct thwip of a crossbow firing. My heart pounded as I watched the footage over and over. She had done it. She had actually hunted Clover like a trophy animal right from her backyard. Armed with this evidence, I knew I had to act fast. I made copies of the footage and sent it to the wildlife research team along with my report. But I needed more. If Linda had really taken down Clover, she wouldn't have done it alone. She was too entitled to get her hands dirty with the aftermath. That's when I remembered something. Linda's husband, Greg, was a loudmouth who loved bragging about his wife's accomplishments. If Linda had killed Clover, there was a good chance Greg had spilled the details to someone in the HOA. The next morning, I paid a visit to my neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, one of the few decent people in the HOA. She had lived there for over 20 years and didn't care for Linda's antics. I played dumb, casually bringing up the sudden disappearance of the deer. It's so strange, I said, feigning ignorance. I haven't seen that deer in a while. I hope nothing happened to her. Mrs. Carmichael's face twisted into a knowing frown. "Oh, I wouldn't be surprised," she muttered. "Linda has been gloating about taking care of a problem for days now. And Greg? That fool can't keep his mouth shut. He was bragging about how Linda finally got rid of that overgrown rat at the last HOA meeting. My stomach churned with disgust, but I kept my voice even. Really? Did they say how?" Mrs. Carmichael leaned in conspiratorially. "They wouldn't say outright, but Greg laughed about having to hose down the patio afterward. If you ask me, that sounds like someone butchered something right in their backyard. That was all I needed to hear." Between the security footage, the broken GPS tracker, the remains near her property, and the witness statements, I had enough evidence to put Linda in serious legal trouble. It was time to take the next step. Armed with undeniable evidence, I wasted no time. The next morning, I contacted the state's wildlife enforcement agency and provided them with everything: the security footage showing Linda stalking Clover with a crossbow, the broken GPS tracker, the deer remains near her backyard, and Mrs. Carmichael's testimony about Greg's loose lips. The agent I spoke with didn't mince words. "If she killed that deer, she's in serious trouble," he said. "Tampering with government wildlife tracking equipment alone is a felony. And if she hunted within a residential area, she broke at least half a dozen state and federal laws." That was all I needed to hear. They assured me they would investigate immediately, and within hours, a team of wildlife officers and law enforcement arrived at my farm to go over the details. They took statements, reviewed the footage, and even collected DNA samples from the deer bones I had found. The lead officer nodded grimly after examining the evidence. "This isn't just a case of illegal hunting. If she knowingly targeted a tracked research animal, she could be facing major fines and even jail time." I felt a sense of vindication as they headed toward Linda's house, but I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. I followed at a distance, just in time to see them knocking on her front door. Linda answered, wearing the same smug expression I had come to despise. But when she saw the uniforms, her smile wavered. "Can I help you?" she asked, feigning innocence. The lead officer didn't waste any time. "We have reason to believe you illegally killed a protected deer on your property," he said firmly. "We need to ask you a few questions." Linda scoffed, crossing her arms. "Oh, for God's sake, is this about that stupid deer again? It was a nuisance. I did the neighborhood a favor." One of the officers raised an eyebrow. "So you admit to killing the deer?" Her face twisted with realization. "I know. I didn't say that." She let out a nervous laugh. "You can't prove anything." I stepped forward then, holding up my phone. "Actually, Linda, we can." I played the security footage, her lurking in the woods, the moment she raised the crossbow, and the distinct sound of the shot. The color drained from her face. One of the officers pulled out a notepad. "That, along with the remains found near your yard and the tampered GPS tracker, is more than enough evidence. Do you have the weapon you used?" Linda's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no sound came out. Then, as if on cue, Greg stormed out from inside the house. "What the hell is going on?" he barked. The officers turned to him. "We have reason to believe your wife illegally poached a research animal. We need to inspect the premises." Greg, who had likely thought nothing of Linda's crime before this moment, suddenly looked panicked. Wait, hold on, this is all a misunderstanding." The officers weren't buying it. "Sir, do you have a crossbow on this property?" Greg hesitated, then stupidly blurted out, "It's just for target practice." One of the officers nodded. "We'll need to confiscate it." Linda finally snapped. "This is ridiculous. It was just a deer. You people are acting like I committed murder." The lead officer didn't flinch. "You committed multiple wildlife violations, including the destruction of government property. Those are serious offenses." Linda looked like she was about to protest, but when one of the officers reached for his handcuffs, she clamped her mouth shut. "We'll need you to come with us for questioning," he said. "Refusing to cooperate will only make things worse." I stood back, arms crossed, as they led her away. Greg tried to argue, but even he knew he was outmatched. As Linda was placed into the back of the law enforcement vehicle, she shot me a look of pure hatred. I just smiled. Clover might have been gone, but at least justice was being served.
Linda might have thought she was untouchable, but reality hit her like a freight train the moment she was hauled away by law enforcement. The charges against her weren't just some minor fines or a slap on the wrist, she was facing serious consequences. Illegal hunting within city limits, tampering with government property, destruction of a federally tracked research animal, and even reckless endangerment for discharging a weapon in a residential area. The cherry on top? The HOA was now turning against her faster than I had ever seen a group of people flip. Word spread like wildfire. Within hours of Linda being taken in for questioning, the neighborhood's private online forum exploded. At first, there were a few die-hard HOA loyalists trying to downplay the situation, but as more details came to light, people were horrified. "She killed a research animal," one post read. "I heard she butchered it in her backyard," another chimed in. Greg, likely panicking, tried to do damage control, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. "Linda was just acting in the neighborhood's best interest," he wrote in a long-winded post that reeked of desperation. "That deer was a pest, and she had every right to protect her property." Big mistake. The comments ripped him apart. She shot a deer with a crossbow in a suburban neighborhood? She literally bragged about it at the HOA meeting. Are you serious right now? Bro, she tampered with a GPS tracker that belonged to a wildlife research team. That's a federal crime. Y'all are screwed. It got worse for them. The HOA president, someone who had previously been indifferent to Linda's antics, put out a statement distancing the association from her. "The actions of an individual do not represent the values of our community," it read. "We do not condone illegal hunting or the destruction of protected wildlife." Translation? We don't want her dragging us down with her. By the time Linda was released pending her court date, she was met with an entirely different neighborhood than the one she had ruled over for years. People who had once admired, or at least tolerated, her were now treating her like a social pariah. Even some of her closest allies in the HOA had turned against her, embarrassed to be associated with the scandal. I watched from my porch as she stormed back into her house, face red with fury, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Greg, on the other hand, seemed to realize just how deep in trouble they were. A few days after Linda's arrest, I caught him outside loading things into his truck, his posture tense and shoulders hunched. He wouldn't even look in my direction. The next time I checked the HOA forum, someone had posted a rumor: Linda and Greg might be selling their house. I couldn't help but smile. But there was still one last thing I needed to do.
The legal process moved faster than I expected. The evidence against Linda was overwhelming. Between the security footage, the destroyed GPS tracker, the remains of clover found near her yard, and the witness statements, there was no way she could wriggle her way out of this. The state's wildlife enforcement agency was relentless in pursuing charges, making it clear that interfering with a government wildlife tracking project was no small offense. When her court date arrived, I made sure to be there, sitting in the front row with my arms crossed, watching as the weight of her crimes came crashing down on her. Linda's lawyer tried everything to spin the situation, claiming she didn't know the deer was part of a research program, that she was just trying to protect her property from wildlife, that it was all a misunderstanding. But none of it held up. The prosecution countered every excuse with cold, hard facts. The GPS tracker was clearly marked as government property. The footage showed her actively hunting clover in a residential area, which was already illegal, even if the deer hadn't been a research subject. And the cherry on top, the researchers themselves testified that the study had been in place for over a decade, and Linda had been explicitly warned that harming the tracked animals would come with consequences. The judge didn't hold back. Linda was found guilty on multiple counts, including illegal hunting in a residential zone, tampering with federal research equipment, and destruction of protected wildlife. The penalties were steep. A hefty fine of nearly $20,000, a 2-year hunting ban, and probation with mandatory community service focused on wildlife conservation. But the best part? The judge made it crystal clear: if she violated any wildlife laws again, she'd be facing jail time. Linda's face was a mask of fury as the verdict was read. I could see the rage simmering beneath the surface, her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might shatter. But there was nothing she could do. No threats, no manipulation, no HOA influence could save her now. She had done this to herself. After the trial, things spiraled even further for her. Though, once her personal kingdom wanted nothing to do with her. They held a meeting where they voted to remove her from any leadership position within the community, citing her actions as an embarrassment to the neighborhood. The people who had once feared her were now openly condemning her. Homeowners who had been quiet before started filing complaints against her and Greg, dredging up years' worth of petty HOA abuses. It was poetic justice in its purest form. And then came the final blow. Linda and Greg put their house up for sale. They couldn't handle the scrutiny, the isolation, the knowledge that they had gone from being the enforcers of neighborhood rules to being the town's biggest joke. The queen of the HOA was dethroned, reduced to a bitter, humiliated mess who had lost everything over a deer she killed for fun. I won't lie, watching that for sale sign go up in their front yard was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. I didn't feel bad for her. Not one bit. Clover had been a wild animal, but she had been a part of my farm, a part of the research project, and a part of my world. Linda had stolen that from me, and now she was paying the price. The day they finally packed up and left, I stood on my porch, watching as their moving truck pulled away. Linda sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, refusing to look in my direction. But Greg? He glanced at me, and in that split second, I saw its shame. He knew they had lost. They had played a stupid game, and they had won the ultimate stupid prize. As their car disappeared down the road, I took a deep breath, looking out at the woods where Clover had once roamed. I couldn't bring her back, but I had done right by her. Linda had learned the hard way that actions have consequences, and I had made sure justice was served. And with that, peace returned to my farm. No more HOA drama. No more Linda. Just me, my land, and the wildlife that belonged here far more than she ever did.